We're going to start the second part by talking about various organelles within the cell. And the first of these is called the power plant of the cell. And this is known as the mitochondrion. And the mitochondrion, pictured over here, is a specialized organ that produces energy for the cell and for the cell functions. Now, the mitochondrion is made up of an outer membrane, which is smooth with pores that allows molecules to pass in and out of the mitochondrion. There's an inner membrane, which we'll look at in some detail in the next few slides. This is a tightly folded membrane where molecules enter and energy is produced. And then within this area is also known as the matrix, which is between these various folded membranes. And also in this area is the intermediate space, which is this space between the outer membrane of the mitochondrion and the inner membrane of the mitochondrion. Now, in the inner membrane are these generators that produce the energy, and the generators produce the energy using an enzyme known as ATP synthase. And ATP is the energy currency of the cell. And in a future lecture around the biochemistry, I'll explain what I mean exactly by that. But these are tiny ion-powered turbo generators that drive this shaft in such a way as to produce energy. Now, the second of the organelles is the protein factories. These are where the proteins are produced. And proteins are the most important molecules in the cell, and they are responsible for multiple functions. I've talked about enzymes. Enzyme is just a specialized protein that catalyzes chemical reactions, as an example. The ribosomes are the primary protein-producing organelle factory in the cell. And when we go through DNA and how DNA works, I will be showing you exactly how the ribosome functions in order to produce a protein. The process of producing a protein from the coding DNA is called translation. And again, in this future lecture, we will discuss exactly how translation goes forward. Now, the ribosomes are embedded in a network known as the endoplasmic reticulum. And this is a network of interconnected sacs and tubules. Now, there are actually two kinds of endoplasmic reticulum. In the lumen of the endoplasmic reticulum is where the produced proteins are ultimately deposited. But the rough ER, which is shown large here on where my pointer is now, you can see that the ribosomes are embedded in this membrane, and it's shown as this sort of starry sky appearing area. That's the area where the protein production occurs. And then there's the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, which is these areas where there is no yellow dots or no ribosomes. And the enzymes here the purpose is to break down waste products and any drugs that happen to be introduced. So you have rough ER, which has the ribosomes embedded in the membrane, and then you have smooth ER over here where there are no ribosomes. Now, the ER, or endoplasmic reticulum, is then connected to what looks like a stack of pancakes, which is enlarged here. This is called the Golgi apparatus. And the Golgi apparatus is also known as the shipping center of the cell. And its purpose is essentially to package these proteins and other materials that are produced in the ER, endoplasmic reticulum, and put it into these vesicles. And the vesicles are the packages of proteins and other molecules which are extruded. And you can see they're actually sort of pinched off the Golgi apparatus, and they go out into the cell. Now, there's also what's known as recycling centers for the cell. And the recycling center for the cell is called the ribosome. And the reason it's called the recycling center is the ribosome takes what is picked up by various organelles, including the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and it packages them into the lysosome. Okay, and the lysosome then uses enzymes to break down these extra materials and recycle the components back into the rough ER and into other areas of the cell to be used again. Lastly, I'll talk about these storage containers. You can see this big sort of blob-looking area in this plant cell, and animal cells don't have as many of these. These are called vacuoles. And vacuoles are storage spaces where the cell stores materials. Now we'll move from the cytoplasm to the nucleus. And the nucleus is the control center of the cell. And so the nucleus is the site where the DNA is stored and where DNA is replicated and where RNA is many times created. And again, in this future lecture around DNA and RNA, I'll be showing you how that happens. And so here we see the nuclear membrane in large size. It has an outer membrane and inner membrane. And then there are nuclear pores that allow the transportation of large molecules inside the nucleus and outside the nucleus. And inside the nucleus is DNA, which I've referred to before. It stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. And it is the chemical that's responsible for controlling the cell. The way it controls the cell is it is responsible for producing all the proteins that the cell produces, and the proteins are what controls what the cell does. And in this area you can see the nucleus is here in the middle, and these nuclear pores are right here and here. That's what's shown in this area here. And then around on the outside there are ribosomes studded on the outside of the nuclear membrane as well. I'll talk about the nucleus in a second. The nuclear envelope is this area that separates the nucleus from the cytoplasm. And as I said, these nuclear pores, which are shown here, are responsible for allowing the proteins to move inside and outside the cell. Now, DNA is stored in an area known as chromatin, and these chromatin acts like a spool, sort of like if you think of thread on a spool. The DNA is wrapped around this protein and it stores the DNA in a spool-like structure. Now, I mentioned the nucleolus. The nucleolus is here in the center, and the nucleolus is where the ribosomes are produced. So let's take a few minutes, because part of the quiz in biology is going to be diagrams where you will have to identify certain structures within the cell. As we do this, I will show an arrow, and I want you to think in your mind what the structure is. And then if you have to stop the tape or stop the recording so that you can either write down what you think it is, so that this will be a practice for you. So here's the first arrow, and it's pointing at the nucleolus. The second arrow is pointing at the nucleus. The third arrow is pointing at the mitochondrion. The fourth arrow is pointing at these two perpendicular spool-like structures. That's called the centriole. This area is pointing at folded membranes without ribosomes, so it's the smooth ER. This is pointing at folded membranes with ribosomes, so it's the rough ER. This is the stack of pancakes and there's these vesicles being pinched off, so this is the Golgi apparatus. And then this is the lysosome. And so this is a typical diagram that you'd have to be able to identify structures on. Now, another way I could do this is a matching, where I would point at something and you'd have to match it with its function. So, for example, let me back this up one. Let's say I just pointed at this, and on the other side, on the matching side, the matching would be placed where cellular materials are recycled. And so instead of just giving the name, you might have to match it with the function. So if I pointed at, let me back it up 2 places here. Let's say I pointed at this. This is the place where proteins and various other chemicals are packaged. You would match that to this picture on the diagram. And then this is the cell membrane. Now, a cell's function primarily is to maintain its life or simply stay alive. And the way it does it is it maintains a stable internal environment known as homeostasis. And in order to do that, it has to control certain physical factors, such as pH, which is the acid content in the internal environment, the temperature, the collection of food, and the elimination of waste products. And also it has to maintain its osmotic pressure. Now this osmotic pressure is the pressure generated by the balance of water and molecules inside and outside the cell. If there's too much water inside the cell can blow up and ultimately rupture. And if there's not enough water in the cell, it can collapse. And so maintenance of the osmotic pressure is also quite important. The other thing the cell has to do is make and store energy. Now, plant cells have a unique property known as photosynthesis, which it takes the energy of sunlight and converts that into a usable form of energy. Now, the releasing of energy comes in the form of what's known as cellular respiration. Now, we will talk about this in the future. There are actually 3 forms of respiration. External respiration, which is the exchange of air from the outside into the organism and back out. Internal respiration, which is the exchange of oxygen from inside the lung tissue to the cell, and from the cell back to the lung tissue. And then cellular respiration, which is at the cellular level, the use of oxygen to produce energy. And as I said before, the production of energy comes in the form of producing a molecule known as ATP, or adenine triphosphate. And the triphosphate bonds are where the energy is stored and transported through the cell for use. Fermentation is another way of producing energy, and fermentation can produce energy without the presence of oxygen, so it would occur in what's known as an anaerobic environment. Anaerobic environment means without oxygen. The process of photosynthesis and the process of cellular respiration are opposite processes. The reactions look very similar, but they're in the opposite direction from each other. So here you see on this left side, you see a chloroplast, which is where photosynthesis occurs. Carbon dioxide enters the plant through the leaves, and photosynthesis occurs within the chloroplast, producing glucose and oxygen. Then this is then taken up in the mitochondrion to produce energy for the plant, and then the plant uses that energy and carbon dioxide that's produced to continue the process back through. And so you have photosynthesis on this side and cellular respiration on this side. Now, cellular respiration is the only process that occurs in plants and aerobic cells. There's no photosynthesis in animals and aerobic cells. And so they have to eat their source of energy, which is they eat the plants or each other, and use that energy in order to perform the cellular respiration.